Hello, still becoming, and welcome back to another episode 36, titled Who Told You That You Needed Permission? Kind of piggybacks on last week's episode of about confidence, and whether or not, am I allowed to? And so, this episode kind of just continuation, maybe those of you that are still suffering out there and, just you're finally finding that confidence and you need just that extra episode or just extra pick me up. Or even if you're just listening to this episode the first time, go back and listen to that other one. Maybe it'll give you even more permission to say, yes, I do belong here. I am allowed to, And so I just, want to hopefully give people at least that empower them to know that, hey, you're working tough and, embrace it a little bit. You don't have to go out and tell people, yeah, I'm that good. That's not what it's about. It's mostly just about you embracing that. You feeling excited that you did that. You could share it with someone. And when you're sharing with them, you don't have to share it with them like, I'm the best. You just share it with them like, oh, I'm so excited. I just have to tell someone I did this workout. So, as we get into it, again, episode title, who told you that you needed permission? And I just, I want to ask you guys something, who told you you needed permission to believe in yourself? Seriously, who was it? Because somewhere along the way, many of us learned that confidence had to be earned, that we had to accomplish enough, suffer enough, prove enough before we were finally allowed to say, I think I can do this. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I'm training for a marathon. As those of you know, it's in October, and the goal I'm chasing, it kind of, honestly, it scares me. I've done it before. I've gotten close to it a few times. It shouldn't scare me, but, there's days I look at the number and, I'm thinking like, maybe this is possible, especially coming off this past weekend or a weekend ago. I felt really confident about what I was doing. Again, it started to hit me and I was like, yes, I can do this. But then, almost immediately, another voice comes in and says, don't get too far ahead. Don't get, ahead of yourself. You're getting cocky. And, people like you don't dream big. It's amazing how fast, confidence, it gets interrupted. There's that distinction that I struggle with, confidence, it's not arrogance, but I sometimes feel like it is. And I think you just need to be able to separate those two. I think a lot of us get confused by confidence, with arrogance or just confidence and arrogance. Arrogance is definitely saying I'm better than everybody. Confidence it says, I believe I'm capable of it. Those are two different conversations. I mentioned that on the last episode. That kind of difference between the two. And I think in some cases, you just have to hear that a few more times, and, for me, for the year, for years, I've thought if I admitted I wanted something great, people would think I have too much of an ego. And so I played small. I downplayed my goals. I apologized for dreaming. I almost asked permission before saying what I wanted to, but why? If your dream doesn't hurt anyone, why are you personally apologizing for it? Why are you feeling this need to be embarrassed by telling anyone? There's this hidden voice, and I've realized something. Most of us aren't waiting for permission from other people anymore. We're waiting for permission from ourselves. We're waiting until we're thinner, faster, smarter, more experienced. We're waiting to be older. I'm 40 now. I think I'm older now. Or I couldn't do it anymore. I need to be younger again, and or more successful. And that's when I'll finally believe. But it's a trap. That day will never come. Because every time you reach one goal, your brain simply moves the finish line. It says, you're getting there close to the finish line. You're thinking of that confidence. I think I can actually do this. And then you look down the road and, your brain simply moved it and was like, I don't want to do it. It's a little scary, and it's not actually looking for proof. It's looking for certainty. And certainty, it doesn't exist in the way that your brain's trying to tell you, especially if you're chasing something meaningful. For me, my running's teaching me this. It's teaching me this marathon build, is something I didn't expect. Some workouts have been incredible, like a couple weeks ago, and others have been scared, and they've scared me. I didn't think I could hold that pace. It's going to hurt, and I don't I don't really want to hurt in that way. I know I'm going to have to accomplish those goals, but just that thought of hurting, it scares me. And I think, why do it? And then there are mornings I think maybe I can do this, but then only to be told, and then an hour later, I don't belong. My brain will start telling me that. Nothing changed physically, only the story changed. And that's when I do realize my confidence can't depend on the last workout or the last race or someone else's opinion. Confidence has become a decision, not a feeling. Feelings come and go, commitment stays. And so, in closing, I want to leave you with this one question. Who are you waiting for? Who needs to approve your dream before you start believing in it? Because maybe no one. Maybe the permission slip you've been searching for has been sitting in your own hand this whole time. Believe before you're certain. You need to take the next step before you're fearless. Speak kindly to yourself before you think you've earned it. And maybe that's exactly why you deserve to keep going. I just want to say thank you for spending time with me these last few minutes. This wasn't the traditional long episode, like I've been accustomed to making, those 10-minute, 12 minutes. This is just something a bit shorter, something a bit to kind of, again, keep piggybacking off that confidence of the last episode 35. And, I just want to tell you guys, remember, you can follow your journey. It just needs it just needs you, and you can also follow my journey. You have a person that's chasing his passion and having the struggles just like you. You can find that on Instagram at stillbecoming26. And I really want you guys to remember, you are still becoming, and you are the only one stopping you. I'll see y'all next time. Bye.